Now that we know how to create new models and pass in all of the attributes that make that particular model, such as first name, middle name, last name, role, and password for a new user model, and having seen that we can obtain additional information and still dynamically add values to our new objects, now it is time to see how we might save an object and get it into the database. So here's where we're going to save. So we are going to save the user using a callback function. At this point in time, you should be pretty familiar using callback functions in that with JavaScript, we do a lot of asynchronous calls. Anytime we're dealing with I/O, so input, output, we use callback functions or callback handlers. And with that is simply a function that handles the return event of an asynchronous call. And being that we're dealing with a database, and now that we have a user model, we want to store that new user in our database, that indicates we're going to be making a network request across the internet or across our network to the MongoDB server, so to that DBMS. And that DBMS is then going to have to find the database we are talking about, find the collection we're talking about, store the data in that collection, and then come back and tell us whether it was successful or not. Because that's asynchronous, we need to make sure we use callback handlers in order to check to make sure that our new user was actually saved. So right here, we're going to write the code for saving a Mongoose model to the Mongo database using a callback handler or a callback function. So our new user is the new model. It now has all of the data in it, and we saw that when we did a breakpoint in the last video, that even our dynamically added email address was added as a new property on that object. Now we're going to go ahead and save it to the database, or we're going to make a request for Mongoose to store it in the database. So we use user.save, and as I stated, when we do user.save, we need to pass it a callback handler or a callback function to handle that asynchronous return. And here, when we send a save request, we are going to get back either an error message or no error message, and we're going to get back the actual newly saved model. And let's go ahead and call this saved user. And then we need to provide the body of our handler right here. Make sure you get your semicolons in the right place. Now, with this, it's a good habit to get into to check to see if there was an error in the save. And this is where we would get errors if any of our attributes fail to meet the schema requirements, such as email. If it's not a string or we don't have it, we would get an error back right here. So always check for errors. Now, if we have an error, we want to break out of that function after we let the user know that we had an error. So I'm going to do a simple console.log. I'm going to let everybody know that an error has happened. And then we're going to go ahead and log the error to the console so we can see it. If there's no error, then we want to go ahead and do a console.log. And we, just for our own sake to see that everything's working, we are going to log the new ID for the newly created user. So let's do saved user dot underscore ID. And the underscore ID, this is your first experience with this. The underscore ID is the unique identifier that is created by MongoDB each time we insert a new document into the MongoDB database. And so we get this unique identifier that's auto-generated and guaranteed to be unique within our database. And it's usually how we're going to pull records when we need to update or retrieve records, which we'll learn about in future screencasts. And then just for the fun of it, so we can see, I'm going to go ahead and do a console.log. Oops. And I am going to log the actual user document that came back. So let's do saved user, and I just want to see that object saved to our, well, printed out to our terminal. All right, so we're handling errors, we're logging if there is an error, and then if we have a saved user, we're going to go ahead and see that this saved user actually has an ID, and then we're going to print it out and see what it actually looks like. So let's go ahead and run this again. We're going to run it in debug. And here you can see we've got the connection to MongoDB was successful. We're in our create user test. We can see that we have a brand new unique ID for an object. And here you can see the object that is printed out is actually a model. And that is because this is a Mongoose model that we sent off to be stored in MongoDB. And now we can see all of its values, or all of the values that we set on it as part of its attributes. And that's what we expect. A user should have an email, a first name, an ID, last name, middle name, password, and its role. So it looks like that was all successful. Let's see what happens if, so I'm going to go ahead and stop our debug. Let's see what happens if we forget to provide a required attribute of our model as defined by our schema. And here we see that email has to be of type string and it's required. And so I just commented out the email address that is usually added to our object dynamically later. And when we go to save this, we should get an error back that tells us that we are violating one of the constraints in our schema. So let's go ahead and run this in debug mode. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here at line 48 so we can step through it. So let's start debug. Executes. Here we are at line 48. And if we click on error, we can see that we have an error. So the user validation failed. We have an error here. And the message that we have here is that user validation failed. The email is required. So email is required. And so if we go ahead and continue playing on this, we will see that the console will print out the error. We have a validation error with user validation failed. And again, email is required is the error that we're getting in our error message right here. You can see how this can be extremely helpful in making sure that the data we're storing in our database conforms to a particular schema, and that things that we need or should be required within our business domain, we can assure that they're required before they actually get saved to the database. So let's go ahead and uncomment this so that we have our user. Let's go ahead and rerun our code. And we stopped right here. You can see we've got no error. It's null. So we should see it continue on to these two logs. So I'm going to step over, and then go ahead and click play. And we can see we've got a new ID. We've got a new model. Now let's go ahead and stop our debugger. Let's run over here to our compass. And you see we're already in our Mongo test app and we are in the users collection. So let's go ahead and refresh this collection. And we now see that we've got two objects in here. Of course, we've got duplicates because we don't have any constraint on first name and we don't have any constraint on email. So these are identical objects. So that's something we would have to handle in our business logic if we wanted to make sure that all emails are also unique. So we would have to handle that in our business logic inside of our schema. And that would be done by simply adding down here a unique is true. So here in our schema, we just added another validation on the email field. Number one, it has to be string. Number two, it needs to be there. And number three, it needs to be unique within our collection. So now if we try to add test again, we should get ourselves an error right here that says we can't insert that because it is not unique. So error right here, it's null. So let's go ahead and click play. And down here, let's look at this. No errors. Our email is still the same. So let's refresh our database. And it is not unique. It looks like it's the same. So let's go ahead and look at this. Well, we said it needs to be unique on the email. So let's try it one more time and see what happened. So let's go ahead and run debug. Should stop at error. Looks like error is still null. So go ahead and click play, come back to our database, refresh. And you can see it's still not unique. So that means we are not doing something right inside of our Mongoose schema. And of course, as it is in programming, we're going to come over here. We're going to look at schemas, and we are going to try to find something that allows us to set something as a unique column. So let's do a find and look for the keyword unique. I don't see anything in this documentation right here for documents. Let's go to schema. Let's do a find unique. Nothing. Let's search inside of here for unique. Schema type options prototype unique. So let's go ahead and click on this and see what we've got here. Got ourselves the schema type options, prototype unique. So let's go see how we use it. So let's go to schema types. And let's look for an example of where they use unique, where something needs to be unique. Here's an example of a min and max that you can put on a type number. So that's cool. Here's an example of setting something to a default if a value isn't provided. That's kind of cool when you're dealing with dates and you want to go ahead and set the most recent update value of it. But we are looking for something that tells us, oh, look, you can make sure that it's lowercase. You can have it trim white space. So those all can be done for you. But where is the option to make something unique? Required default select, validate, get alias. Oh, here's unique right here. Unique. So we've got test, type is string, index is true, unique is true. So if we read this documentation, unique index, if you specify unique true, specifying index true is optional if you do unique true. And so unique, whether to define a unique index on this property. Right? So it looks like we did what we were supposed to. Let's go ahead and add this index option to it, even though it says it's optional. Go ahead and add index to true. Make sure we save this, stop our debugger. So we've got index true, we've got unique equals true. Then we will go ahead and start the debugger. Should break right here. Still no errors if we click play. And then we go back to our compass and we refresh. We see that it's still allowing the same value to come in through that. So for some reason, unique is not working. So the next step that we would do, hopefully this is helping you guys understand how we debug and how we work through problems. Let's do Mongoose Schema unique not working. Look, other people have asked the same question. So let's go to a recent one. So here's here's one that was done in 2019. So we'll click on this, and here somebody's got the same thing here. We've got type equals string, required equals true, unique equals true. If there are already duplicate emails in your collection, then the new constraint won't work. Fix the already duplicated data in your database first. All right, so before we added that constraint to our application, we already had duplicate data inside of our database. Now, being that we're just doing a test database, we've only got 5 records in there. We're going to go ahead and let's just wipe out all of these records so we can start fresh with that new constraint involved. Once we do that, let's refresh really quick. We've got 0 records. And if you think about it, that actually really does make sense. If you already have an active database and you're already using that database and you already have unique data in that particular field of all of your documents, and then you decide you want it to be unique, it'll be really hard for the database to put an index on that, and it would be impossible for it to ensure that all of them are unique because you already have duplicate data in there. So that really makes a lot of sense. And this was really good practice in trying to figure out why something doesn't work as we intend it to. So now that we've got that on there, now that it is set to unique, let's go ahead and let's try running this a couple times and see what happens. So we're going to restart it. We got no error, of course, because we have no records in there right now. This is going to be the first record with that email address. So let's come back, refresh, and we see we've got test@test.com. We've got a new object. All right, so let's try running it again and see if we get an error this time. Here we've got an error. We got our error. It's a duplicate key error in the collection, meaning that we have a duplicate email address that just failed us. And you can see the key value right here that was a duplicate, and that is the email. And we have test@test.com. So our system is now doing what it's supposed to. Our schema is now validating our data like it's supposed to. And in order to get another one in there, we're going to have to change the email address that we used. So I'm going to go ahead and put an A in front of it. We'll run this again. We should have no error this time. Yep, it's set to null. So if we click play, we should be able to come in, refresh, and we see that we have a new entry, but it is a test@test.com. And if we run this again, we should have it break on that error with a validation error. Yep. We've got a duplicate key, which is the A test. So if we just go ahead and click play, if we change this to AB, and click save, reload, we should have no error, which means we should get a document inserted. And if we come back and refresh, we now see that we've got our test, we've got an A test, and we've got a B test. Excellent. That is, of course, the purpose of this video was to show you how to save new objects using a model, in this case our user model, and passing a callback handler or a callback function to handle the return of that IO event. In other words, saving this new object to the Mongo database.